We're sitting in what is probably the heartland of my electorate, the Federal seat of Calwell, and I've been the member for Calwell for 5 terms now. I was first elected here in 2001, and I have my professional background was a teaching background. I myself am probably a 1.5 generation migrant, because I was born overseas and I came here as a young child, and grew up obviously in the northern areas, the suburbs of Melbourne. And it's a great pleasure for me to be, and a great honour actually, to be the federal member for Calwell, because this seat has been named after Arthur Augustus Calwell, who was Australia's first immigration minister and the architect of the great post-Second World War migration program that saw my family come here, and hundreds of thousands of migrants and refugees from World War II torn Europe, at a time when Australia was in need of population, and it was commencing a massive nation-building program that 60 years later we are seeing the benefits of that migration program, and we're now facing a new great leap forward for the next 30 or 40 years of migration and nation building. So it's an interesting time to be a member of Parliament, and it's a great electorate that I represent, because it's my story and their story is the migrant story. I came here in 1963. Australia in the 60s was a slightly different place, in the sense that it was a more insular society, and the Australians of the time were receiving huge numbers of people that were coming out of Europe, and many of them, in particular the Southern Europeans, were very different to the Northern Europeans in terms of skin colour. And the one thing that I remember very well is that we were the brown-skinned people, because many of the Italians and the Greeks and even from the Middle East who came later were olive-skinned. And so the issue of skin colour, I remember that very well. What I also remember very well is that because the Australian community had not yet begun to understand the diversity as we understand it today, my generation had to assimilate in the 60s into the Australian culture. So we, as children, I remember dealing with that in a way where I describe it as living a double life. But when I was at school, when my parents enrolled me at my local primary school, Maria was considered to be not an Australian name. So, we laugh about it today, but this is the reality. I was called, so they changed my name. I was given an Australian name, and I went from being Maria to Mari, and my sister went from being Helen to Ellen, and because we had to have Australian names. So during the day, I'd be Mari, and of course at home, I would go home to my community, to my neighbourhood, and I would be Maria. So my generation, up until about the early 70s, kind of had to be both, try to be Australian during the day and be Greek at home. The expression, go back where you came from, that we're all familiar with today, or don't speak that language, that was a common occurrence for us and our families in particular in the 60s. But gradually, the political leadership of the early 70s through Gough Whitlam, incidentally, Arthur Calwell, I would describe now, as I look back at the history, as the father of multiculturalism, because Arthur Calwell brought to Australia a diversity of people, and his attitude towards that intake was to ensure that they understood the society that they lived in, and that they were made to feel as quickly as possible a part of that society. It intrigued me to learn that Arthur Calwell spent a lot of time getting to know the communities at a grassroots level. We didn't have the multiculturalism policy at the time, but everything that government was doing was laying the foundations. So he made it his business to get to know the communities that he brought here. Anything from going down to the pier and welcoming them to actually becoming, godfathers to their children. So they were doing things in a way that later allowed for Gough Whitlam and even Malcolm Fraser, the two major parties, to start to understand that we had an incredible diversity in this country of languages and of culture, which was also introducing new food. If you came to a Greek or Italian house, you didn't have to make an appointment. You could just come. And if you came during dinner, there would be so much food that it wouldn't matter. And I think what actually started to break down a lot of those barriers and suspicions and resentments at the neighbourhood level was very much around food, and it was around socialising and getting to know each other. And a lot of our Australian neighbours loved coming to our homes because they began to enjoy our food. So that was the beginning of a practice that allowed politicians of the time to realise that we have something very significant in this country and we need to build on it. And therefore multiculturalism as a policy was born, and we had from that a realisation that we had to help our diversity integrate in a way that we met each other halfway. That we became Australians through our citizenship, but we also brought with us an incredible wealth that, in addition to working in the factories, was actually going to build this country, and which it did. And look at where we are today, in this wonderful place of wonderful sweets, and this is now it's an Australian way of life.